In just 47 minutes, Jasmine Crockett turned a late-night talk show into a battleground for healthcare justice. She confronted a system live on air, a system that decides who lives and who dies, not based on need, but on race and income. Millions of Americans watched as Jimmy Kimmel was forced to rethink everything he thought he knew. But here's the question. Can one televised reckoning really change decades of brutal inequality? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The set of Jimmy Kimmel Live glowed under the weight of golden and blue spotlights, the stage polished to a mirror sheen, every camera humming softly as it broadcast live to millions of homes. Every seat in the audience was filled to capacity. Men and women packed shoulder to shoulder, laughing, clapping, leaning forward in their chairs, riding the comfortable wave of late-night humor. Jimmy Kimmel, with his familiar, easygoing grin and rolled-up sleeves, tossed out clever jokes about the absurdities of American healthcare. $800 aspirin bills, endless hold music on insurance hotlines, and doctors who couldn't explain their own invoices. The crowd erupted in laughter. A little too loud, a little too eager, like people laughing to keep something darker at bay. On the far side of the stage, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her face an unreadable mask, her eyes following every move with the quiet precision of someone who knew. The real conversation hadn't started yet. Around her, the panel of healthcare advocates exchanged wary glances, the kind of glances soldiers give each other before stepping into no man's land. The cameras panned across the smiling faces in the crowd, but not even the most polished editing could hide the growing tension coiling at the edges of the room. Jimmy, sensing the subtle shift, let the laughter trail off naturally. Before leaning forward on his desk, the corners of his mouth tightening almost imperceptibly. The studio lights seemed a little harsher now, as if magnifying the truth about to break through the carefully crafted entertainment. "You know," he began, his voice dropping to a quieter, heavier tone that immediately pulled the audience closer. "It's all funny, until it's not." A different kind of silence fell, a silence full of breath held too long, of hearts tightening in anticipation. Jimmy's hands, normally animated and expressive, stilled as he spoke about the night his son Billy was born. The machines, the alarms, the sterile panic of hospital corridors. His words weren't polished. They stumbled out, rough and cracked at the edges, making them land all the harder. "When the doctor told us Billy's heart wasn't right, I have never been so scared in my life. Nothing prepares you for that moment." He paused, swallowing against the lump in his throat. And in that pause, the room seemed to shrink around him. "It's not just fear," he continued, voice hoarse now. "It's this helpless, gnawing terror, knowing that even if you'd give up everything you own, every dollar, every breath, it might not be enough. Because in this country, saving your child isn't just about medicine. It's about money." Some members of the audience lowered their eyes. Others gripped the arms of their chairs tighter, the reality too sharp to look at directly. Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat frozen in place, the storm rising silently behind her calm expression. Because she knew, had always known, that for millions of families who didn't have fame or fortune or public sympathy, there was no doctor rushing into the room, no camera crew ready to amplify their cries for help. The truth Jimmy had revealed cracked the surface of the room. But what came next hit with the force of an avalanche. The grief, yes, but now sharpened into fury. Jimmy sat a little closer to the edge of his chair, no longer the polished host, but a father stripped down to something raw and real. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, fingers digging into the wood as he launched into the next chapter of his story. The chapter too messy for polite headlines. He spoke of the endless, frantic calls to hospitals across the country, his voice catching as he remembered the way polite voices on the other end would stiffen the moment insurance was mentioned. "I didn't care where the hospital was. I didn't care how far we had to go. I just wanted someone, anyone, to say they would help him," Jimmy said, his voice thick and cracking. But all they cared about was whether we had the right paperwork, the right numbers in the right boxes. The studio lights seemed to dim as his words filled the space. And somewhere deep in the audience, the murmurs of shifting bodies began. People struggling with the realization that for all their laughter, this story wasn't entertainment, it was indictment. Jimmy's face hardened as he described sitting up all night with a phone in one hand and a credit card in the other, ready to buy his son's life if that's what it took. "We were lucky," he said bitterly, the words spitting from his mouth like a curse. "We had a platform. We had people who cared enough to listen. But what about the families who don't?" His voice rose, cutting deeper, no longer hiding the anger that had been brewing beneath the grief. "What about the father who works 2 jobs and still gets told, 'I'm sorry, your insurance doesn't cover this surgery'? Where's the help for him?" Jimmy's face twisted in something close to rage as he stabbed his finger into the desk for emphasis. "Politicians are happy to stand in front of a hospital with a giant pair of scissors and smile for the cameras. They love to talk about family values when it's convenient. But when my son needed a miracle, and I needed them to actually do something, where were they?" His voice echoed in the stunned silence, the words crashing against the walls like a battering ram. The audience sat frozen, caught between guilt and helplessness, as if Jimmy's fury had peeled back some ugly truth they could no longer pretend not to see. Jimmy's anger still rang through the studio like the echo of a struck bell. But across from him, in the gathering silence, another force was quietly building. A storm with a different kind of fury. Jasmine Crockett sat frozen at first, her posture composed, her face a portrait of impassive calm. But beneath the stillness, something shifted, subtle and seismic. Her right hand tightened on the smooth armrest of the guest chair, the skin at her knuckles blanching white for just a moment before she forced it to relax. Her breathing slowed deliberately, controlled and deep. Not the panicked gasps of someone blindsided, but the steady inhalations of a fighter who had been waiting for the bell to ring. The camera, almost sensing the shift, drifted closer, catching the faint tightening around her mouth and the razor-sharp focus in her eyes. Those eyes, cool, steady, unwavering, locked onto Jimmy, not with resentment, but with a weight that seemed almost unbearable. To the casual viewer, she looked unshaken. To anyone who understood real power, it was clear. She was drawing a line inside herself, preparing for war. In that moment, Jasmine didn't need to speak. Her silence screamed across the studio louder than any speech, louder than any applause. Slowly, Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat, and the energy in the room shifted so violently it was as if the earth itself had tilted beneath the stage. It was not the hurried, fumbling rise of someone eager to interrupt. It was something calculated, something ancient. A force gathering its full strength before striking. The subtle scrape of her chair against the glossy floor seemed to echo off every hard surface in the studio, louder than it should have been, making every head snap toward her as if pulled by an invisible thread. Jimmy Kimmel's mouth faltered open slightly, confusion flickering across his face. The easy rhythms of the talk show shattered without warning. Jasmine straightened to her full height, the lights glinting sharply off her polished suit, throwing clean, hard lines across her shoulders and face. Her hands, once loosely resting in her lap, now hung at her sides, like the silent thread of a blade yet to be drawn. Her eyes, cool, steady, ferociously alive, locked onto Jimmy's with a gaze so powerful, so unflinching, that it sucked the last nervous energy from the audience and replaced it with pure, electrified stillness. To the cameras, she looked poised, composed. But to anyone truly watching, it was clear. She was no longer waiting for permission to speak. She allowed the weight of her standing presence to fill the room first, owning the space, commanding the silence like a general commanding an army. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried with the gravity of something undeniable. "Your pain is real," Jasmine said, each word striking with the precision of a drumbeat inside a funeral procession. "No one here will ever question the fear, the helplessness you felt." She paused, not to collect herself, but to make sure every eye, every mind, was locked onto hers, unable to escape the truth coming next. She took a single step forward, not hurried, not tentative, but measured, each footfall reverberating through the bones of everyone watching. "But don't you dare," she continued, her voice deepening, her tone sharpening like a sword being drawn across stone. "Don't you dare use your tragedy to erase the lives of those who never even got the chance to beg for help." Another heartbeat of silence. "Don't turn your story into a wall that shuts out the screams of those this system was built to ignore." The words did not land softly. They struck the studio like a hail of hammer blows, scattering the last illusions of comfort or safety among the stunned, frozen faces in the crowd. The room still trembled with the shock of Jasmine's words. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She had shattered the surface. Now she would show them what lived beneath it. Jasmine stood at the center of the stage, a dark silhouette framed by the brutal honesty she had unleashed, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing steady. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need tears. When she spoke again, her tone was calm, eerily calm, the kind of cold, deliberate clarity that made the truth sharper, more painful. "I had a cousin," she began, her eyes never leaving Jimmy's, though her voice was now reaching past him to the millions beyond the camera lens. 17 years old, smart, funny, loved basketball, loved annoying his sisters, loved dreaming about the future he thought he had time to build. Her voice didn't quiver, didn't hesitate. It was clinical in its control, like a surgeon describing the facts of a fatal wound. "He had a heart murmur, nothing catastrophic, nothing urgent," they said, "if it was managed properly. But we didn't have insurance." The words dropped into the studio like stones into deep water, each one pulling the room further under. She shifted her weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but to anchor herself even more firmly where she stood. "So we waited," Jasmine continued, her voice as smooth and sharp as ice. "We waited for an appointment we couldn't afford, in a system that told us without saying it that his life was a line item too expensive to save." There was no dramatization, no appeal for pity. Her restraint made the horror even worse, each sentence landing like a silent hammer against the air. "He collapsed one night during practice, collapsed on a basketball court under a flickering gym light, gasping for air while a coach who couldn't afford a defibrillator tried to keep him alive." Her words painted the scene in brutal strokes. No embellishments, no tears, just reality in its most merciless form. "The ambulance took too long. The hospital turned us away at first because we couldn't prove we could pay. By the time someone finally decided he was worth saving, it was too late." The audience, which had moments ago been breathing in careful, even beats, now sat motionless. It wasn't just sadness. It was horror. It was complicity. Jasmine's voice did not rise, did not falter. 17 years old, she said again, almost softly this time. 17! Dead because healthcare in this country asks first for your insurance card and second for your symptoms. She did not wipe away tears. There were none. She did not bow her head or clasp her hands in some visible display of grief. She simply stood there, weaponized by the very thing that had tried to break her family and failed: the truth. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing her face in perfect, merciless detail. The set of her jaw, the calm storm in her eyes, the absolute refusal to let this moment pass as just another sad story. Jasmine let the silence that followed stretch until it became unbearable, until the audience squirmed, not from boredom, but from the pain of their own realization. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a design, a feature, not a flaw, of the system they had all accepted as normal. The studio, which had once crackled with the easy humor of late-night television, now felt more like a courtroom after a guilty verdict had been read aloud. Even Jimmy, who had spent years mastering the art of reclaiming a room with a joke, found himself paralyzed, trapped under the unbearable gravity Jasmine had summoned with nothing but her story, and the steely, ruthless honesty with which she told it. In the crowd, something shifted. Not a sound, not a cry. Something quieter, but infinitely more powerful. People leaned forward, not in curiosity, but in allegiance. They weren't just listening to Jasmine now. They were following her, being pulled into her orbit by the undeniable, searing truth that no joke, no wealth, no fame could shield them from forever. In that instant, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a guest on a talk show. She wasn't just a congresswoman or a lawyer. She was a mirror held up to the country, showing them everything they had tried not to see, and forcing them to look anyway. The cameras kept rolling, but the rules of television no longer applied. The applause signs stayed dark. No one dared to move. No one dared to even whisper, as if speaking would somehow desecrate the raw sanctity of what had just been laid bare before them. Jasmine didn't thank them for listening. She didn't ask for permission. She simply stood there, a woman who had weaponized her silence into a blade sharper than any rhetoric. Her cousin's name went unspoken, but his life, his stolen future, filled the room so completely that it felt as if he were standing there beside her, a silent witness to the indictment she had just delivered. And for the first time since the cameras had started rolling, the audience began to shift, not toward the easy practice sympathy of a celebrity's tragedy, but toward the harder, heavier realization of systemic betrayal. Toward her, toward the truth. The air inside the studio had turned dense, suffocating, as if everyone were bracing for a second impact they knew they couldn't escape. And when Jimmy shifted forward, it wasn't toward healing. It was toward a fight. Jimmy sat up sharply, his elbows planted firmly on the edge of the desk, his shoulders tense, every inch of him crackling with the stubborn anger of a man who had been hurt too deeply to surrender. His voice broke the heavy stillness like a whip crack. "I've seen death," he said, each word striking the air with the force of someone trying to anchor himself to a truth too painful to bear. His hand slammed lightly against the desk, a hollow sound that reverberated across the frozen studio. His face flushed, not with shame, but with the frantic, almost desperate need to be understood. Not as a celebrity, not as a host, but as a father. "You think I don't know pain?" Jimmy snapped, his voice rising against the rising tide of silence. "You think I haven't paid a price?" His chest heaved with the effort, his whole body leaning into the moment, willing the audience, willing Jasmine in to see the battlefield he had survived. But Jasmine did not flinch. She did not soften. She stood there, rooted in the truth of a pain even deeper than his. And when she answered, her voice carried the cold, merciless clarity of a blade slicing clean through the fog. "You understand personal pain," she said, and the steadiness of her voice made the contrast almost unbearable. "Like fire meeting the unmoving face of stone. But I understand systemic injustice, the kind that kills dreams before they're even born. The kind that decides, long before anyone gets sick, who deserves a second chance and who doesn't." She took one small step closer, her presence growing heavier with every word, her eyes never leaving his. "You fought one battle," she continued, her voice quieter now but even more devastating. "But millions of us are fighting wars every single day. Wars we were drafted into just by the accident of where we were born, how we look, how much money our parents had in their pockets." Each sentence fell like hammer blows in a courtroom with no possibility of appeal. Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. No sharp retort, no clever deflection, only the raw, visible struggle of a man realizing he was standing on ground far shakier than he had ever admitted to himself. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he leaned back into his chair, the aggressive fire draining from his posture, as the weight of her truth bore down on him. The audience, who had moments earlier clung to every word of Jimmy's righteous anger, now shifted again. This time, not out of loyalty, but out of something older, something harder to shake: recognition. A single sharp exhale broke the silence, a rush of breath from somewhere deep in the crowd. Not loud, but unmistakable. The sound of a wall cracking. The sound of certainty giving way to something infinitely more dangerous. Doubt. The cameras, still rolling, caught every flicker of emotion. Jimmy's clenched jaw, the faint tremor in his hand, and the unstoppable rising tide in Jasmine's eyes that said without words, this fight was never about winning an argument. It was about revealing a truth no one wanted to see. Jimmy's silence still echoed across the studio, but Jasmine didn't rush to fill it. She let it burn. She let it hollow out the room, because the real blow hadn't even landed yet. With the same deliberate calm she had wielded all night, Jasmine reached for the folder resting on the table beside her. She didn't fumble. She didn't shuffle for effect. Every motion was clean, precise, almost surgical. She opened the folder and drew out a stack of papers, statistics, reports, government findings, and laid them flat before her, as if presenting evidence before a jury that could no longer claim ignorance. "Let's talk about facts," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. "Not emotions, not anecdotes. Facts!" The camera zoomed tighter, capturing the steady composure of her hands, the steel in her posture. She raised the first page, her voice steady and cold enough to make the hairs on the back of every neck in the room stand upright. African Americans are 3 times more likely to die from preventable diseases than white Americans. 3 times. Latino children are twice as likely to be uninsured compared to white children. Rural hospitals have been shutting down at a rate of nearly 1 per week because the profits aren't high enough to justify saving lives. She flipped the page with a crisp snap, each sound loud in the deathly quiet room, hammering reality into every corner of the studio. "The number one predictor of whether you'll survive a major illness in America," Jasmine said, "isn't the quality of your doctor. It isn't your willpower. It's your zip code." She let that sit for a moment, looking out into the blinding lights, the sea of faces barely breathing. You can work 2 jobs, pay your taxes, raise your children right, and still be condemned by a system that decided long ago that some lives are simply too expensive to save. Her hand hovered over the next page, but she didn't need it. The data was already burned into her bones. "And make no mistake," Jasmine added, her voice hardening even further, "these aren't numbers. These are names. These are faces. These are families sitting by hospital beds, praying to gods who sometimes answer, but more often are drowned out by the ring of a cash register." The audience didn't stir. They couldn't. The weight of what they were hearing pinned them in place. Every breath shallow, every heartbeat loud. Jimmy sat rigid in his chair, his hands folded tightly together, his gaze locked onto the surface of his desk, as if it could somehow shield him from the truth slicing the air around him. Jasmine took a slow step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the studio floor, with a finality that was almost funereal. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She simply stated, with a clarity that would be replayed for days across every television and social feed in America. "So I ask you, Jimmy," her voice dipped lower, colder, sharper. "I ask every person watching at home. I ask every politician who ever posed for a photo outside a hospital and called it progress." She let her gaze sweep across the cameras, pinning not just Jimmy, but the entire nation to the wall. "Is your child's life worth more than the life of a homeless child? Is your fear more valid than theirs because you had the money to be heard?" The silence after her question was not soft. It was shattering. It cracked the bright, polished facade of the talk show into 1,000 sharp pieces, exposing the raw truth beneath, that the system had never been about saving everyone. It had always been about deciding who was worth saving. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't look away. She stood in that silence and let it become her ally. The roar of everything unspoken crashing like thunder behind her calm exterior. She didn't need to explain the implications. She had ripped the veil away, and what remained could not be unseen. In that moment, she was no longer just a voice among many. She was the reckoning itself, standing unmoved in the center of a broken empire, pretending it was whole. The cameras continued to roll, but they captured something rare now, something raw, something undeniable. Not just the pain in Jimmy's clenched jaw, or the tears brimming in the eyes of scattered audience members. They captured the shift. The realization that this conversation was no longer about pity or celebrity or even politics. It was about survival, about justice, about the millions whose names would never trend on Twitter, but whose lives deserved to be fought for just as fiercely. And as Jasmine lowered the papers slowly back onto the table, her final act wasn't a dramatic gesture or a triumphant smile. It was a simple, searing silence. The silence of someone who had told the truth so thoroughly, so unflinchingly, that no one dared to speak against it. The question Jasmine had unleashed still hung in the air like smoke after a battlefield explosion, thick, choking, impossible to see through. And when the dust finally began to settle, all eyes turned, waiting for Jimmy to speak. For a long, excruciating moment, Jimmy Kimmel sat frozen, his fingers interlaced tightly on the desk before him, his shoulders tense under the crushing weight of a truth he could no longer dodge. The man who had built his career making millions laugh now found himself facing a silence so profound, it seemed to carve the very oxygen out of the room. The cameras stayed locked on his face, capturing the flicker of shame, the raw vulnerability that stripped away the last layers of his public armor. His lips parted once, then closed again, words floundering before they could form, as if he were wrestling something dark and furious inside himself. Jasmine didn't move. She stood exactly where she had planted herself, offering no lifeline, no softening glance, only the steady, unrelenting gaze of someone who had fought too long to allow easy exits. Somewhere in the audience, a chair creaked under shifting weight, the only sound amid the studio's crushing stillness. Jimmy's hand moved slightly, almost reflexively, as if reaching for a joke to toss out like a life preserver. But none came. He blinked once, swallowed hard, and when he finally spoke, his voice was nothing like the polished, confident cadence America knew. It was raw. It was real. "Maybe," Jimmy said, his voice cracking at the edges, "maybe I've been too focused on my own experience." The words, once released, seemed to flatten the room completely, as if the very act of saying them had pulled gravity tighter around everyone's chest. No music, no applause, no quick cut to commercial, just the sight of a man known for filling silence with humor, now standing naked inside it, fully exposed. Jimmy didn't rush to explain himself, didn't scramble to patch the fracture with a joke or a clever turn of phrase. His hands stayed still on the desk, his eyes damp but not yet spilling over, locked on to some invisible point beyond the camera lights, somewhere far beyond the safety of the stage. The audience didn't move, didn't breathe. They seemed trapped inside the enormity of the moment, frozen between the man Jimmy had been a minute ago and the man he might still become. Even the technicians in the booth, hidden behind walls of screens and wires, hesitated with their fingers hovering over the next cue, unwilling to interrupt the raw, unscripted humanity unfolding live before the nation. Jasmine remained silent as well, her presence towering in its stillness, giving Jimmy no out, no distraction, no escape from the confrontation he had been forced to have with himself. It was not a moment built for television. It was too messy, too unscripted, too true. Jimmy inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling, like a man who had just surfaced after being underwater too long. "I thought," he said, voice softer, "that my pain, that what I lived through, gave me the whole story." He shook his head slightly as if hearing his own naivety for the first time. "But it didn't. It only gave me my story." The words weren't just confession, they were surrender, a slow, painful laying down of arms in a war he hadn't even realized he'd been waging against the truth. Across the vast room, small shifts in the audience finally stirred again. Not the restless fidgeting of discomfort, but the slow, careful movement of people rethinking everything they had been prepared to believe when they walked through the studio doors. They weren't watching a celebrity anymore. They were watching a reckoning. They were watching a man, stripped of all performance, forced to confront a reality so much larger, so much crueler than the world he had been living inside. Jimmy rubbed the back of his neck with one shaking hand, his mouth tightening against the surge of emotions threatening to break through. But he didn't look for the easy way out. He didn't laugh. He didn't deflect. And that, perhaps more than any admission he could have spoken, was what made the silence afterwards so deafening. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of a truth so heavy, so absolute, that the studio could no longer pretend it wasn't sitting right there between them. Jasmine didn't soften. She didn't rush to comfort him. She had seen too many apologies wilt into empty gestures when the lights faded. Instead, she simply stood there, patient, immovable, the storm after the fire, and let the moment carve itself into the bones of every person watching. No one applauded. No one cheered. The cameras stayed fixed, merciless and honest. And for the first time in what felt like hours, maybe longer, maybe forever, Jimmy Kimmel had nothing left to say. The heavy silence wrapped itself tighter around the studio, and for one long, suspended breath, it felt as if the entire world balanced on a single thread. And then, in the center of that fragile moment, Jasmine moved, not to condemn, but to offer something even more powerful. Jasmine stepped forward, her movements steady and unhurried, as if she had been waiting all night, not for victory, but for this exact reckoning. She didn't look triumphant. She looked resolute, her face carved in sharp lines under the studio lights, her voice cutting through the charged air with the precision of a scalpel. "If you truly care," Jasmine said, each word ringing out across the room with undeniable force, "then don't just feel sorry. Don't just apologize." She took another step closer, standing now at the edge of Jimmy's desk, the distance between them a chasm bridged only by the truth that had been laid bare. "Help me," she said, her voice low but fiercely steady. "Help me fight for those who don't have the platform you have. Help me push forward the Healthcare Equity Act." There was no desperation in her offer, no begging. Only a simple, brutal demand for action, for partnership, for proof. For a split second, the cameras caught the flicker of emotion on Jimmy's face, the tremor of a man weighing not just his reputation, but his soul. And then he moved. Without hesitation, without theater, without any of the polished instincts that had once guided his every moment in front of a camera, Jimmy Kimmel stood and reached across the distance between them, his hand extended, open, unguarded, trembling slightly in the bright, merciless light. Jasmine didn't falter. She stepped forward and took his hand in hers, the two of them locked in a grip that was more than symbolic. It was seismic. The moment their hands met, a sound exploded across the studio. Not the carefully cued applause of a television audience, but something raw, something real, something that surged from the lungs of people who had just witnessed history claw itself into existence. Applause erupted like a thunderclap, rolling through the room in waves so powerful the cameras themselves seemed to shake. It wasn't the polite clapping of entertainment. It was the roar of human beings who had been forced to face a broken system, and now at last saw two people reaching across the divide to fight it. The camera operators, trained to follow action with precision, instinctively swung their lenses wider, capturing not just Jasmine and Jimmy, but the faces of the audience. Faces wet with tears, faces shining with something dangerously close to hope. A woman in the third row clutched the hand of the man beside her mouth covered by trembling fingers. A young man in the back wiped his eyes with his sleeve, his chest rising and falling in great shuddering breaths. Even the stagehands, normally invisible, stood frozen in the wings, their headsets forgotten around their necks, caught in the gravitational pull of a moment that no script, no producer could have ever planned. Jasmine squeezed Jimmy's hand once, firm, fierce, final, and then released it, stepping back just slightly but never breaking eye contact. There was no need for more words. The handshake had said everything. The fight would be hard. The system would not yield easily. But for the first time in what felt like an endless night, there was a sliver of light breaking through the cracks in the ceiling. Jimmy swallowed hard, his face still pale but determined, and turned slightly toward the audience, visibly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just unfolded. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was rough, almost ragged at the edges. "Then let's do it," he said simply, and the roar of the crowd rose even higher, shaking the rafters, making the lights overhead tremble as if the building itself were straining to hold the force of their voices. The camera swung wide again, capturing every angle. The union of two hands across an impossible chasm, the faces transformed from numbness to defiant belief. The way the entire room seemed to pulse with a new, electric urgency. It wasn't polished. It wasn't clean. It was messy and real and heartbreaking and necessary. And somewhere beyond the lights, beyond the applause, beyond even the millions watching live at home, a different kind of noise began to build. A ripple of conversations, of debates, of demands that would not end when the credits rolled. Jasmine stood silently, letting the waves of noise crash over her without flinching. Her hands relaxed now at her sides, her chest lifting and falling slowly with the weight of everything she had carried to this moment. This wasn't victory, not yet. It was simply the first stone hurled against the wall. But it was enough. It was more than enough to shatter the silence that had suffocated too many for too long. Jimmy wiped at his face once with the back of his hand, the movement small, unguarded, and shockingly human. There was no script to follow now, no easy jokes to reclaim the safety of distance. There was only the raw, messy work ahead, the work of dismantling a system that had for too long placed price tags on human lives. And in that instant, under the merciless lights and the weight of a nation watching, Jimmy Kimmel didn't shrink from it. He stood there, shoulders square, eyes clear, facing the storm he had once tried to avoid. The studio lights glinted off Jasmine's cross pendant, a small but unmissable point of light amid the towering shadows. She tilted her head slightly toward Jimmy, a gesture so subtle most would miss it. But it was there. Acknowledgement, challenge, and warning all at once. The fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. And the road ahead would demand more than good intentions and handshakes. It would demand everything. The roar of the audience swelled again as the cameras continued rolling, drinking in the faces of hope, of anger, of determination. It caught the image of a mother clenching a photo of her son who hadn't survived. It caught the image of a nurse clapping with hands calloused from decades of overtime shifts in crumbling hospitals. It caught the image of a young girl watching from her father's shoulders, her small hand pressed against her mouth, eyes wide with something like awe. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett stood unmoved, a sentinel at the gateway between what was and what could be, her face calm, her heart a drumbeat against the false walls of a broken world. The last echoes of applause still thundered through the studio, but in the spaces between each beat, there was something even greater, something that couldn't be scripted, couldn't be staged, the feeling that something irreversible had just begun. The cameras slowed their frantic sweeping across the crowd, gradually tightening their focus, locking onto the two figures at the heart of it all. Jasmine Crockett and Jimmy Kimmel stood side by side, framed beneath the fierce, white-hot glare of the studio lights, the roar of thousands of hands colliding around them like a living ocean. Jasmine, tall and steady, her suit catching glints of the overhead spotlights with every slight shift of her shoulders, looked straight ahead, her expression composed but unyielding. Jimmy, still visibly shaken but standing firm, wiped once at the corner of his eye before lowering his hand slowly, as if even the smallest gesture carried the weight of a vow he had no right to take lightly. Between them, no words were exchanged, but none were needed. The image alone, the handshake that had passed, the truce that had collided, spoke louder than any speech ever could. They were not equals in their fight. Jasmine had carried the weight for far longer, had bled on battlefields Jimmy was only now glimpsing. But still, for this single moment, they stood together, and the sheer audacity of it made the room hum with energy too big to be contained. The applause didn't dwindle. It grew, rolling through the rows like a wave gathering force, driven not by entertainment, but by a collective need to witness, to acknowledge, to affirm what had just unfolded. Jasmine's eyes remained sharp, cutting through the sea of faces, not in triumph, but in solemn recognition. She had seen applause before, empty, performative, fleeting. But this was different. This was heavier, realer. She could feel it in her bones, in the slight tremble of the floor beneath her heels, in the churning thrum of hundreds of beating hearts aligned, for once, on the side of justice instead of comfort. Jimmy shifted once, glancing sideways at her, and though he said nothing, the look in his eyes, the quiet acceptance, the relinquishing of old ignorance, was louder than any declaration. Around them, the crew stayed frozen at their stations, unwilling to break the spell, their headsets forgotten, their carefully timed production schedules abandoned. Somewhere backstage, producers watched in stunned silence, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be replayed and remembered long after the evening's ratings were tallied. Jasmine lifted her chin slightly, not in pride but in defiance, a silent reminder to every viewer, every policymaker, every bystander. This was not the end. This was the first crack in a dam they had all pretended would hold forever. The lights above them pulsed slightly, the intense heat soaking into the fabric of their clothes, the sweat at their temples, but neither moved. They stood like monuments, two figures marked by different journeys, now briefly aligned by something bigger than either of their individual stories. Jasmine could feel the electricity in the air, sharp, biting, alive. It wasn't just admiration aimed at her, it was a demand, a summons. The people watching from the audience, from their living rooms, from their hospital beds and kitchen tables, were not applauding because a celebrity and a congresswoman had shared a moment. They were applauding because, for the first time in too long, someone had spoken a truth powerful enough to crack the marble mask of American healthcare wide open. Jimmy's shoulders sagged slightly, the exhaustion of the night finally beginning to settle into his bones. But he did not run. He did not retreat. He stood there beside her, even when every instinct of self-preservation must have screamed for him to find an easier way out. Jasmine didn't glance at him, didn't offer a comforting pat or a soft smile. She wasn't here to rescue him from the consequences of seeing clearly. She was here to show him, and everyone else, that seeing was just the beginning. Change was the price of clarity, and clarity was the debt they had all been too afraid to pay. The final camera shot tightened, the frame closing around them as the cheers rose to a crescendo, so deafening it seemed to shake the air itself. Jasmine's eyes never wavered. Jimmy's hands remained at his sides, open, vulnerable, human. No music played them off stage. No comedic skit buffered the moment. There was no curtain call, no closing monologue, no laugh track. Just the two of them illuminated in brutal, beautiful honesty, standing beneath a blaze of lights that felt less like a celebration and more like a trial by fire. And when the director finally reluctantly gave the signal to cut the feed, the screen didn't fade to black with laughter or applause. It froze for one heartbeat longer than protocol would normally allow, on the image of Jasmine and Jimmy standing shoulder to shoulder. No words, no slogans, just two people, bound not by victory, but by the shared, blood-raw acknowledgement that real justice demanded far more than any one night's applause could give. The sun rose heavy and red over Los Angeles, casting a bruised light across the city that had, for once, witnessed something it couldn't immediately package and sell. In the control room of Jimmy Kimmel Live, exhausted producers watched as the night's footage went viral faster than any comedy bit they had ever aired. By breakfast, the image of Jasmine Crockett and Jimmy Kimmel, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the unforgiving studio lights, was everywhere. The headlines came first, crashing through every news feed and social platform like a flood. An unlikely alliance, Kimmel and Crockett stand for healthcare equity. Justice on late night, Jasmine Crockett breaks the system open, from comedy to conscience, a night that changed everything. The video clips were even more powerful than the headlines. Viewers around the world watched as Jasmine's calm, relentless voice delivered truths most networks had spent years sidestepping. They watched Jimmy falter, stumble, and finally offer his hand, not in charity, but in surrender. The handshake was replayed in slow motion, set to soaring orchestral music in some edits, turned into a raw, unfiltered clip in others. Every angle was dissected, every glance analyzed. Social media predictably erupted into civil war. On one side, gratitude, celebration, awe. Thousands of messages flooded Jasmine's public page. Thank you for speaking for those of us who have no voice. You made me believe again. Healthcare isn't a privilege. You made them listen. On the other side, fury, Rage, the old, predictable venom of those who mistook comfort for truth. Comment sections filled with accusations. She ambushed him. Just another angry politician trying to make everything about race and class. If you don't like the system, leave. Death threats followed. Subtle at first, anonymous emails, vague warnings, but then louder, uglier. You'll regret what you did. You made powerful enemies tonight. By mid-morning, cable news vultures circled the story like bloodthirsty hawks. Some anchors praised Jasmine's courage. Others twisted her words, claiming she had bullied a grieving father, that she had weaponized sympathy for political gain. Pundits lined up to take sides, each one more desperate than the last to seize a piece of the firestorm before it burned itself out. Inside a modest, nondescript office in D.C., Jasmine sat alone, her back straight, her face impassive, watching the chaos unfold on a muted television screen. The morning news played silently across the wall, each Chiron more incendiary than the last. Hero or villain? Jasmine Crockett, the most dangerous woman on television. Her phone buzzed nonstop, calls from staffers, allies, journalists, opportunists. Aides begged her to clarify, to soften the message, to seize control of the narrative. Political advisors urged caution, whispering about polls, donations, re-election risks. Security consultants warned her to vary her travel routes, to avoid public events without private protection. Jasmine said nothing. She simply watched, the flickering images reflecting in her steady, unblinking eyes. Because she knew, this was not a mistake. This was not a scandal. This was the beginning. When her chief of staff finally burst through the door, papers in hand, face flushed with urgency, Jasmine barely glanced up. "They're coming after you," he said breathlessly. "Super PACs, lobbyists, media groups. You poked the beast." "I didn't poke it," Jasmine replied quietly. "I dragged it out into the daylight where everyone could see it." She turned off the television with a single click of the remote, plunging the room into silence except for the low hum of her phone vibrating across the desk. Message after message after message. Support, hatred, threats, invitations. The full cacophony of a country struggling to decide whether to crucify her or follow her. She opened her laptop, hands steady, and began typing. Not a retraction, not an apology, but the first draft of what she knew would come next. The Healthcare Equity Act wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a rallying cry. It had blood in its veins now. It had faces, names, histories. The nation had seen a glimpse of itself in the mirror Jasmine had held up, and now it had to choose whether to shatter the mirror or finally start cleaning up the reflection. Across the city, Jimmy Kimmel faced his own storm. The executives at ABC were nervous. Sponsors called with concerns. Lawyers whispered about contracts and public relations crises. But Jimmy, sitting alone in his office, replayed the moment again and again. The handshake, the roar of the crowd. Jasmine's voice slicing through the illusion he had once called truth. He knew deep down that Jasmine hadn't humiliated him. She had saved him from himself. Later that afternoon, a carefully worded statement appeared on Jimmy's official social media pages. "Last night was not about me. It was about listening, about learning, about standing for something bigger than all of us. I stand with Jasmine Crockett in the fight for healthcare justice." The statement caught fire. It wasn't perfect. It didn't undo decades of imbalance. But it was a line in the sand, a promise to those who needed it most. This conversation wasn't going to end when the studio lights dimmed, but Jasmine knew better. She knew the attacks would keep coming. She knew that for every supporter who sent her a thank you message, 10 more were plotting to silence her. She sat back in her chair, closed her eyes for one long moment, and let the weight settle onto her shoulders like an old familiar coat. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. Because movements were not built on applause. They were built in the fires of backlash, in the loneliness after the cheering stopped, in the relentless refusal to step down when the world demanded surrender. Outside her office window, the city moved on obliviously. Cars honking, people bustling, deals being struck and broken and forgotten in gleaming towers that scraped at the bleeding sky. But somewhere out there, in the hospitals, in the shelters, In the schools with broken heaters and empty cafeterias, someone was watching the news replay. Someone was whispering to themselves, maybe change really is possible. And Jasmine Crockett, warrior and witness, would be ready to lead them through the fire. Night fell over Washington, D.C., not with the lazy, glowing warmth of a city winding down, but with the cold, brittle finality of a battlefield settling into uneasy silence. The streets emptied into long stretches of shadow, broken only by the flickering of broken street lamps and the occasional ghostly hum of traffic. Somewhere behind her, in gleaming towers of glass and steel, deals were being struck to erase her name, to shrink her back into silence. Jasmine Crockett pulled the collar of her coat higher against the bite of the wind and stepped off the curb, alone, into the heart of the city she had spent her life fighting for. No cameras followed her now, no staffers hovered at her elbow. Her phone buzzed again and again in her pocket. Alerts, calls, desperate attempts to pull her back into the sanitized world of statements and optics. But she ignored it. Tonight was not about managing perception. Tonight was about remembering why she had started this war in the first place. Her boots struck the cracked sidewalk in steady rhythm, each step cutting through the stillness like a drum beat, a reminder that she was still moving forward, no matter how many forces would try to drive her back. She passed boarded-up clinics where too many had died, waiting for treatment that never came. She passed shuttered pharmacies where once mothers had begged strangers for antibiotics they couldn't afford. She passed schools whose broken windows and peeling paint told a story no State of the Union address would ever acknowledge. And through it all, she kept walking, the city's scars stitching themselves into the fabric of her resolve. At a rundown bus stop, an old woman hunched against the cold, her shopping bags gathered close around her like armor. Jasmine slowed, instinctively reaching into her pocket for cash, but the woman shook her head, her gaze fierce beneath the worn brim of her hat. "I saw you," she said, her voice rough with pride. "On the TV." Jasmine blinked, momentarily disarmed. The woman gave a thin, hard smile. "Don't you let them scare you, baby. Don't you dare." Jasmine nodded once, too choked for words, and kept walking. Blocks later, a group of teenagers in hoodies and battered sneakers clustered on a corner, their conversation falling into hushed awe as she approached. One of them, a boy no older than 16, stepped forward, awkward, unsure, but with a fire burning behind his eyes that Jasmine recognized immediately. "You made them listen," he said, voice cracking under the weight of what it meant to say it out loud. Jasmine smiled, not the polished public smile for cameras, but something raw and real and wounded. "Now it's your turn," she told him softly, and his friends erupted into clumsy applause as she disappeared into the night once more. Everywhere she looked, Jasmine saw the faces that Washington forgot, the immigrant mother rocking a crying baby on a park bench, too afraid of hospital bills to call an ambulance. The war veteran sleeping under a crumbling bridge, his medals sold long ago to pay for medication he could no longer afford. The child sitting on the stoop of a condemned building, clutching a toy with missing limbs. This was her battlefield. This had always been her battlefield. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't televised. It was long nights and broken promises and the stubborn, unyielding refusal to give up when everyone around you said it would be easier to surrender. She thought of her cousin, 17 years old, a future ripped away because a system decided he wasn't worth the paperwork. She thought of the parents who had called her office in tears, begging for help they should never have had to beg for. She thought of every story she carried like invisible scars beneath her skin, every life cut short, every injustice left to fester because fighting it had always seemed too costly for those in power. Jasmine stopped at the edge of a pedestrian bridge overlooking the city. The Capitol dome glowed in the distance, gleaming and hollow under the dark sky, like a monument to promises broken before they were ever made. She leaned against the railing, her fingers curling around the cold metal, the wind whipping her coat around her knees. Above her, the stars blinked dimly behind layers of smog and light pollution, a reminder that even in darkness, even buried by human failure, light could still find its way through. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the cold burn through her lungs, letting the noise of the city fall away until there was only the steady hammer of her heartbeat. Not for applause, not for headlines, not even for revenge, for justice, for those who would never get a platform, for the lives no one else seemed willing to fight for. When she opened her eyes again, the city hadn't changed, but Jasmine Crockett had. She would face the death threats. She would face the smear campaigns. She would face the long, bitter grind of legislation dragged out and watered down and sabotaged at every turn. And she would win. Not because she was invincible, but because she refused to let them convince her that survival was enough. Because she refused to let another generation grow up believing that injustice was inevitable. Down on the street below, the city pulsed with life. Messy, cruel, beautiful life. Jasmine pushed away from the railing and started walking again, each step heavier than the last but no less certain. Tomorrow would be brutal. Tomorrow would be war. But tonight was the quiet before the battle, and she would meet it not with fear, but with the unbreakable resolve of someone who had already lost too much to ever retreat again. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, tucked her chin against the wind, and disappeared into the city she had sworn, long ago, to protect, even from itself. Because she knew one simple, searing truth. Let them build walls. She would become the hammer, and she would not stop until every last one of them came crashing down. The city swallowed Jasmine's silhouette into its restless veins, but even as the night closed in, the lesson she carried refused to be silenced. What she had fought for was bigger than a law, bigger than a handshake, bigger than any single victory. In the end, the fight Jasmine Crockett waged wasn't just against broken policies or corrupt institutions. It was against the deeper, more insidious belief that the world was unchangeable. That injustice was too large, too old, too ingrained to ever be defeated. She understood better than anyone that the true enemy wasn't simply bureaucracy. It was apathy. It was the seductive lie whispered to every broken heart that said, "This is just the way things are." Every child who died in a waiting room, every mother who wept over an unaffordable diagnosis, every worker who chose between groceries and insulin. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were symptoms of a sickness that had metastasized across generations. Jasmine had looked into the heart of that sickness, and she had refused to look away. But refusing was not enough. It was easy to stand in a studio flooded with applause and believe change had already arrived. It was far harder to stand alone on a freezing bridge at midnight and still believe it was worth fighting for. Jasmine knew the applause would fade, the news cycles would move on. The same forces that had built the machinery of inequity would rebuild it, repair it, disguise it in softer language and smiling faces. She knew her enemies were not the loudest voices shouting against her on television. They were the silent hands writing laws in backrooms, calculating precisely how much suffering could be tolerated before the public would notice. True injustice, she knew, was crafted in boardrooms, not shouted from podiums. It thrived not on outrage, but on exhaustion. It waited for good people to get tired, to sit down, to believe the lie that change was impossible because change was inconvenient. And that was the battle no one talked about, the slow, grinding war of attrition that wore down hope, not with violence, but with the simple, relentless erosion of belief. This was the battlefield where Jasmine had chosen to stand, because she had learned something most people never wanted to admit. Real change demands more than courage. It demands endurance. It demands the willingness to keep walking into rooms where you are hated, to keep telling truths that make people uncomfortable, to keep fighting battles you know you may never live long enough to see won. Justice in its truest form wasn't a trophy you held up for cameras. It was a lifetime of bleeding in small, invisible ways, and choosing to bleed again, and again, and again, because the alternative was worse. Jasmine's story wasn't about victory. It was about sacrifice. It was about the quiet, brutal, often thankless work of pushing a system millimeter by millimeter towards something closer to fairness. It was about planting seeds in soil poisoned by centuries of indifference and still believing they would grow. It was about knowing that you might never live to see the harvest and fighting anyway. Jasmine had stood under the lights, faced the fury of a broken world, and extended her hand not because she expected immediate redemption, but because she understood something deeper. Hope is not born in triumph. It is born in defiance. Hope is born when a woman looks at a system designed to erase her and says, "You will not." Hope is born when a father who thought he knew pain realizes that pain is not an excuse to stay blind. Hope is born when a nation watches a single voice refuse to be silenced and realizes it can no longer pretend not to hear. The true lesson of Jasmine's story was not that heroes win, it was that heroes endure. Heroes rise and rise again, bruised and battered, carrying not just their own burdens, but the invisible, crushing weight of those who cannot stand with them. Heroes are not created in moments of applause. They are forged in moments when no one is watching, when the cameras have turned away, when the crowds have gone home, when the cost of fighting seems too high, and they fight anyway. That is what Jasmine Crockett taught the world. That is what justice demands, and it demands it still. Tonight, somewhere in America, a family would sit in a dimly lit hospital room, praying not just for health, but for mercy from a system that calculated their worth in dollars and decimals. Tonight, somewhere in America, a young girl would hear that she couldn't afford to live. Tonight, somewhere in America, the lie would be told again, that survival is a privilege, not a right. But tonight, too, Jasmine Crockett walked the streets of that same America, carrying the stubborn, bleeding, unbreakable truth that no system could erase. Every life matters, not by virtue of wealth, not by virtue of fame, simply because it breathes. And that truth, once spoken, once fought for, once bled for, could never be fully silenced again. Not by politicians, not by billionaires, not even by the apathy that had killed more dreams than bullets ever could. As Jasmine disappeared once more into the restless city, 1,000 lights flickering around her like stubborn stars refusing to go out, she carried with her the quiet, terrible knowledge that real change would not come in a single night. It would come the only way it ever had. Step by broken step, battle by brutal battle, voice by trembling voice refusing to fall silent. And somewhere in 100 unseen places, people who had watched her stand unbroken would now find the strength to stand too. Because courage, once lit, is contagious. And once a single soul refuses to kneel, the ground itself remembers what it feels like to shake. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.